So here's something you might not have thought about before. Every single day, without even noticing it, you participate in one of the most complex systems human beings have ever created. You wake up, you make coffee with beans that were grown in Colombia or Ethiopia by someone you'll never meet. You put on a shirt that was stitched together in Bangladesh from cotton grown in India, using a pattern designed in New York. You drive to work on roads funded by taxes collected from millions of people, burning gasoline refined from oil that was pumped out of the ground in Saudi Arabia or Texas, priced in a currency backed by nothing but collective trust. You tap your phone to pay for lunch, and numbers move between invisible ledgers maintained by institutions that have been around for centuries, or in some cases, were invented last Tuesday. And all of this happens so smoothly, so effortlessly, that you never stop to think about the staggering web of decisions and agreements and historical accidents that make it possible. That web, that impossibly intricate system of who makes what, who gets what, who owes what to whom, and why any of it works at all, that's economics. And tonight, we're going to walk through the whole thing, slowly, from the very beginning. We're going to talk about why money exists, how markets actually work, what inflation really is, why some countries are rich and others aren't, what happened during the great crashes, and why economists keep arguing with each other about basically everything. We'll meet the thinkers who shaped how we understand all of this. Some of them brilliant, some of them wrong in spectacular ways, most of them a little bit of both. And we'll take our time. There's no rush at all. If you drift off somewhere along the way, that's perfectly fine. The economy will still be here in the morning. It always is. Let's start at the very beginning. Because the beginning is simpler than you'd think, and also stranger. Before there were stock markets and central banks and GDP reports, before there were even coins or paper money, people still needed to get things from each other. And the way they did it, for most of human history, was through something economists call barter. You have a cow, I have a pile of wheat. You want some wheat, I want some milk. We make a deal. Simple, right? Well, sort of. Barter works fine if we both happen to want what the other person has. But what if I have wheat, and you have fish, and I don't want fish? I want pottery. Now I have to find someone who has pottery and wants wheat, and hope that person doesn't want fish either, or we're all stuck in a loop. Economists call this the double coincidence of wants, and it's a genuine problem. In a small village, where everyone knows everyone, you can work around it. You trade wheat for fish, then fish for pottery, then pottery for whatever else you need, and eventually, it all sort of balances out. People keep mental tallies. They owe each other favors. It's not really barter in the textbook sense. It's more like a network of relationships and obligations. Anthropologists like David Graeber have argued pretty convincingly that pure spot barter, the kind where strangers swap goods on the spot with no prior relationship, was actually quite rare in most historical societies. What people really had were systems of debt and credit, long before anyone invented money. And that's actually a crucial insight, so let's sit with it for a second. The idea of debt, of owing someone something and settling up later, is probably older than money itself. Think about what that means. The foundation of economics isn't gold coins or paper bills. It's trust. It's the belief that if I give you something today, you'll make it right tomorrow. That's it. That's the bedrock. Everything else, every bank, every stock exchange, every cryptocurrency, is just a more elaborate version of that same basic idea. I trust you. You trust me. Let's make a deal. But trust is fragile, and it doesn't scale well. In a village of 50 people, everyone knows who owes what to whom. In a city of 50,000, that's impossible. You need something to stand in for trust, something that everyone agrees has value, something portable and durable and divisible. You need money. Now, here's what's fascinating about money. It's been invented independently, over and over again, by cultures that had no contact with each other. The Mesopotamians used barley and silver. The Chinese used cowrie shells, then bronze coins. The Aztecs used cacao beans. People in parts of Africa used iron bars or lengths of cloth. In the Yap Islands in the Pacific, they used these enormous stone discs called rye stones, some of them 12 feet across, too heavy to move. The stones would just sit there, and everyone in the community knew who owned which stone. Ownership would change hands to settle debts, but the stone itself never moved. There's a story about one of these stones that sank to the bottom of the ocean during transport, and the community decided it still counted. Everyone agreed the family that owned it still owned it, even though it was sitting on the ocean floor where nobody could see it. Which, when you think about it, is exactly how your bank account works. The money doesn't physically go anywhere. Numbers change in a ledger. The stone on the ocean floor is your direct deposit. The key thing all these different forms of money have in common is that they're a shared fiction. And I don't mean that dismissively. Shared fictions are incredibly powerful. A dollar bill is a piece of cotton and linen with green ink on it. Physically, it's worth almost nothing. But everyone agrees to treat it as if it's worth $1. And because everyone agrees, it works. Money only has value because we collectively believe it does. The moment that belief breaks down, and it has, many times throughout history, we'll get to that, the money becomes worthless. It's paper again, or shells, or very heavy rocks that nobody cares about anymore. The first coins we know of were minted around 600 BCE in Lydia, a kingdom in what is now Western Turkey. King Alyattes stamped pieces of electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, with a lion's head, certifying their weight and purity. The genius of the coin wasn't the metal itself, it was the stamp. The king was saying, "I guarantee this piece of metal contains this much precious stuff. You don't need to weigh it or test it yourself. Trust me, trust the state." And people did. Coins spread rapidly across the ancient Mediterranean, and wherever they went, trade followed, because coins solved the fundamental problems of barter. They were portable, divisible, durable, and universally accepted, at least within the kingdom that minted them. Paper money came much later, and it was the Chinese who invented it, around the 7th century CE. Carrying heavy metal coins over long distances was impractical, especially for large transactions. So merchants began depositing their coins with trusted agents and carrying paper receipts instead. Eventually, the government got involved, issuing official paper notes that could be exchanged for coins. The idea was elegant. The paper itself was worthless, but it represented a claim on something valuable, a promise. And as long as the government honored the promise, the paper worked just as well as coins. But here's the thing about promises, and this is a lesson that echoes throughout the entire history of economics. Promises are only as good as the person making them, and governments, throughout history, have shown a persistent tendency to make more promises than they can keep. When a government needs money, to fight a war, to build a palace, to pay off supporters, the temptation to simply print more notes is almost irresistible. And when they do, and the supply of money grows faster than the supply of actual goods and services, you get inflation. Prices rise. The money becomes worth less. Print enough of it, and it becomes worthless altogether. We'll come back to inflation in detail later. For now, just file away this idea. Money is a promise, and the value of the promise depends entirely on whether people believe it will be kept. So the first great economic invention isn't really a thing. It's an agreement, a collective act of imagination, and once you have that agreement in place, Everything changes, because now you can do something that was almost impossible before. You can specialize. Think about what life is like without money, without a reliable medium of exchange. You have to be mostly self-sufficient. You grow your own food, make your own clothes, build your own shelter. Maybe you're pretty good at farming, but terrible at making shoes, and your neighbor is a great cobbler, but can't grow a tomato to save his life. In a barter economy, you can kind of work this out, but it's clumsy. With money, it's effortless. You farm, sell your crops for money, and use the money to buy shoes from the cobbler. The cobbler makes shoes, sells them for money, and uses the money to buy your vegetables. Now you can each focus on the thing you're best at. That's specialization, and it's one of the most powerful ideas in all of economics. Because when people specialize, they get better at what they do. They get faster. They figure out shortcuts. They develop expertise. The total output of the community goes up, even though each person is doing less variety of work. Everybody wins. This idea, that specialization and trade make everyone better off, is so central to economics that it's essentially the first lesson in every introductory course. And the person who articulated it most clearly, the person who really turned it into a systematic argument, was a quiet, absent-minded Scottish professor who, in the year 1776, published a book that would change the way humanity thinks about itself. His name was Adam Smith, and his book was called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. Usually we just call it The Wealth of Nations, and it's one of the most influential books ever written in any field. But before we dive into Smith, let me tell you a little about the world he was writing in, because context matters enormously. In 1776, the dominant economic theory in Europe was something called mercantilism, and it had been the prevailing wisdom for about 200 years. The basic idea of mercantilism was that wealth equals gold and silver. National prosperity was measured by how much precious metal a country had accumulated. And the way you accumulated it was by exporting more than you imported, selling lots of stuff to other countries, and buying as little as possible from them. The gold flows in, the gold stays. The nation gets richer. This sounds almost reasonable until you think about it carefully. Because under mercantilism, trade is a zero-sum game. If I'm selling you more than I'm buying, I'm winning, and you're losing. Every transaction has a winner and a loser, and governments, driven by this logic, did all sorts of things to tilt the balance in their favor. They slapped tariffs on imports to discourage buying foreign goods. They gave subsidies to exporters. They established colonies, partly for political power, but also as captive markets that could be forced to buy the mother country's products and sell their raw materials cheaply. The entire structure of European colonialism was deeply entangled with mercantilist economics. The British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, these were commercial enterprises backed by state power, and their purpose was to extract wealth from the rest of the world and funnel it home. And here comes Adam Smith, this professor of moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow. Not economics, moral philosophy, because economics didn't exist as a separate discipline yet. And he looks at this whole system and says, essentially, you've got it backwards. Wealth isn't gold. Wealth is the stuff you can produce and consume. The food, the clothes, the houses, the services. Gold is just a convenient way to keep score. And trade isn't zero-sum. When two people trade voluntarily, both of them are better off, or they wouldn't bother trading. The buyer values the good more than the money. The seller values the money more than the good. Both walk away happier. That's the whole point. Now, Smith didn't invent these ideas out of thin air. Other thinkers had been nibbling at them. The French physiocrats, particularly François Quesnay, had argued that agriculture, not gold, was the true source of wealth, and that government interference in markets was generally a bad idea. But Smith took these scattered insights and wove them into a comprehensive, systematic argument that covered everything from the division of labor to international trade to the proper role of government. And he did it in a book that was, despite being over 900 pages long, remarkably readable and full of concrete, vivid examples. Let me tell you something about Smith that I think is just wonderful, because it humanizes him. Adam Smith was famously absent-minded. There are stories about him getting so lost in thought that he would wander miles from his house without noticing. One morning, reportedly while deep in contemplation, he walked out of his house in Kirkcaldy in his dressing gown and didn't realize it until he was miles away, having wandered all the way to Dunfermline, about 15 miles, before someone stopped him. He would talk to himself, gesture at invisible audiences, and trail off mid-sentence if a new idea struck him. He was also apparently terrible at small talk. He lived with his mother for most of his life. He never married. He was, by all accounts, kind, generous, and deeply moral. Remember, his first book, published in 1759, was The Theory of Moral Sentiments, about empathy and the human capacity for fellow feeling. He wasn't some cold-hearted calculator of profit and loss. He was a philosopher who thought deeply about what makes a good society. The most famous passage in The Wealth of Nations is Smith's description of a pin factory. He visited an actual pin factory and watched the workers. Making a pin from scratch, by yourself, is slow work. One person alone might make 1 pin a day, maybe 20 if skilled. But Smith observed that in the factory, the work had been divided into about 18 distinct operations. One person drew out the wire, another straightened it, a third cut it. A fourth sharpened the point. 10 workers, each performing 1 or 2 specialized tasks, could produce about 48,000 pins in a day. That's 4,800 per person. The power of specialization, in cold, hard numbers. And then Smith asked the question that made him immortal. What organizes all of this? Who decides how many pin factories there should be? How many bakers? How many cobblers? Who coordinates the vast web of production and trade that feeds and clothes an entire nation? And his answer was, nobody. The market does it, through prices, through people pursuing their own interests. He wrote that each individual, pursuing their own self-interest, is led as if by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of their intention. The invisible hand, the most famous metaphor in economics. Here's what Smith meant. Imagine you're a baker. You don't bake bread because you care about feeding the hungry masses. You bake because you want to earn a living. But in pursuing that self-interest, you produce bread, which people need. And the price mechanism keeps everything in check. If there are too many bakers and not enough butchers, the price of bread drops and the price of meat rises. Some bakers switch to butchering. Supply adjusts. Nobody planned it. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, Smith wrote, but from their regard to their own interest. But Smith wasn't naive. He didn't think markets were perfect. He argued for public education, for regulation of banking, for progressive taxation. He was deeply suspicious of businessmen, writing that people of the same trade seldom meet together, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public. He would probably have found the extreme laissez-faire position attributed to him simplistic. So that's where we are at the end of the 18th century. Smith has given economics its foundational text. But events were about to test his ideas in ways he couldn't have imagined, because the Industrial Revolution was gathering steam, quite literally, and it was going to create both astonishing wealth and astonishing misery, and force a new generation of thinkers to ask questions Smith's framework couldn't quite answer. The Industrial Revolution is one of those terms that gets thrown around so casually, it's easy to forget how genuinely revolutionary it was. For thousands of years, most humans lived on farms. Economic growth crept along at a pace almost invisible within a single lifetime. Your grandchildren lived roughly the same way you did. And then, in about 100 years, everything changed. The trigger was practical steam power. James Watt's improvements to the steam engine in the 1760s and 1770s made it efficient enough to power machinery. Factories appeared. Textile production was mechanized. A single spinning machine could do the work of dozens of hand spinners. Production exploded. Prices dropped. Then came iron, steel, and railroads. Railroads didn't just move goods faster, they created entirely new markets. A farmer in Yorkshire could sell produce in London. A factory in Manchester could ship output to Liverpool, and from there, anywhere in the world. The railroad collapsed distance and made the economy function as a single system. British industrial output grew roughly fourfold between 1800 and 1850. Manchester went from about 25,000 people in 1772 to over 300,000 by 1850. Cities grew faster than they could build housing, sanitation, or water systems. And this is where the dark side comes in. Workers in early factories labored 14 to 18 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week. Children as young as 5 worked in mills and mines. Machinery had no guards. Cotton dust destroyed lungs. Wages were often barely survivable. The workers who had once been independent artisans found themselves transformed into interchangeable parts, in machines they didn't own and couldn't control. Friedrich Engels came to Manchester in 1842, sent by his wealthy industrialist father. What he found appalled him. He published The Condition of the Working Class in England in 1845, describing streets running with sewage, families of 8 in single rooms, workers coughing black sputum. He asked the question that would define the next century. Who really benefits from this system? And here's something about the Industrial Revolution that doesn't get talked about enough. It wasn't just a technological revolution. It was a revolution in how people thought about time. Before industrialization, most work followed natural rhythms. You worked when there was daylight. You rested when there wasn't. You followed the seasons. A farmer's schedule was dictated by the weather and the crops, not by a clock. But factories needed coordination. If the spinning machine started at 6 in the morning, every worker had to be there at 6, not roughly 6, not whenever they felt like it, 6, on the dot. And so the clock, which had existed for centuries as a curiosity for the wealthy, became a tool of industrial discipline. Factory owners installed clocks and imposed fines for lateness. The historian E.P. Thompson wrote a brilliant essay about this, arguing that the entire concept of time discipline, the idea that time is something you spend, save, or waste, is a product of industrial capitalism. Before the factory, time was experienced. After the factory, time was measured. And we've been living by the clock ever since. This might seem like a tangent, but it actually tells you something deep about economics. Economics isn't just about money and markets. It's about the invisible rules and assumptions that shape our daily lives. Rules we follow so automatically that we don't even notice them. The idea that your time has a monetary value, that there's an opportunity cost to every hour you spend on one thing rather than another, that idea would have been meaningless to a medieval peasant. It's a product of a specific economic system, and it shapes how we think about everything from career choices to leisure time to sleep itself. Which is ironic, given what you're doing right now. Let me explain opportunity cost, because it's one of those concepts that economists consider absolutely fundamental, and once you really get it, you see it everywhere. Opportunity cost is the value of the next best alternative you give up when you make a choice. If you spend an hour watching TV, the opportunity cost is whatever else you could have done with that hour. Worked, exercised, read a book, spent time with your kids. If you spend $100 on dinner, the opportunity cost is whatever else that $100 could have bought. The cost of something isn't just what you pay for it, it's what you give up to get it. This sounds simple, but it has profound implications. It means that the true cost of a free concert isn't zero. It's the 3 hours of your time plus whatever else you could have been doing. It means the cost of owning a house isn't just the mortgage payment. It's also the return you could have earned if you'd invested the down payment in the stock market instead. It means the cost of going to college isn't just tuition. It's also the 4 years of income you could have earned by working instead. Every choice has a shadow cost, an invisible price tag representing the path not taken. And here's a related concept that's just as important: sunk costs. A sunk cost is money or time or effort you've already spent and can't get back. And the rational thing to do with sunk costs is ignore them. If you've bought a movie ticket and the movie turns out to be terrible, the rational choice is to leave. The money is spent whether you stay or go. Staying doesn't get your money back. It just costs you 2 more hours of your life watching a bad movie. But people hate abandoning sunk costs. They think, well, I paid for it, I might as well stay. This is called the sunk cost fallacy, and it leads to all kinds of bad decisions. Staying in failing relationships because of the time already invested, continuing to fund failing projects because of the money already spent, eating more than you want because you paid for the meal. Anyway, coming back to the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution was creating wealth at an unprecedented rate. But it was also creating something else: a class of people who had nothing to sell but their labor, and who found themselves at the mercy of factory owners who controlled the machines, the buildings, and the raw materials. And it was this dynamic, this power imbalance between those who owned and those who worked, that a young German philosopher was about to dissect with surgical precision. That question was the match that lit the fuse for Karl Marx. Marx was born in 1818 in Trier, Germany. His father was a lawyer who had converted from Judaism to Protestantism to avoid anti-Semitic restrictions. Marx studied law and philosophy, got his doctorate, tried journalism, got expelled from several countries for his radical writings, and settled in London in 1849, where he would spend the rest of his life, much of it in genuine poverty, hunched over books in the reading room of the British Museum. Here's a detail about Marx that captures the tension between the man and his ideas. He wrote about the exploitation of workers, about the suffering of the poor. Yet his own family suffered terribly from poverty, largely because Marx refused to take a regular job, dedicating himself entirely to writing and political organizing. Several of his children died young, partly due to poor living conditions. His wife, Jenny, came from Prussian aristocracy and ended up pawning her family silver to put food on the table. Engels was the one who kept the Marx family afloat financially. Engels, whose fortune came from cotton mills in Manchester, the great critic of capitalism, sustained by the profits of a capitalist factory. History has a sense of irony. Here's what Marx actually argued at its core. In a capitalist economy, there are 2 main classes. The bourgeoisie own the means of production: factories, machines, land, capital. The proletariat own nothing but their labor. The fundamental dynamic is that the bourgeoisie extracts surplus value from the proletariat. A worker produces goods worth $10 an hour, but gets paid $5. The difference is surplus value, and it goes to the owner simply by virtue of ownership. That's exploitation, not because the owner is a bad person, but because it's structural, built into the system. What made Marx's analysis so powerful wasn't just the exploitation argument. It was his claim that capitalism contained the seeds of its own destruction. Competition would drive wages down and concentrate wealth. Small businesses would be swallowed by bigger ones. The middle class would be squeezed. Eventually, workers would rise up, seize the means of production, and create a new society based on collective ownership. Some of Marx's predictions were remarkably prescient. Wealth has concentrated. Large corporations have swallowed smaller ones. The tension between capital and labor remains defining. But his prediction of revolution in advanced capitalist countries didn't pan out as expected. The revolutions that claimed his name happened in agrarian societies. Russia in 1917, China in 1949, and the systems they created produced their own forms of suffering on a massive scale. But what matters for our purposes is that Marx forced economics to grapple with questions about power and distribution. Smith was interested in how wealth is created. Marx was interested in how it's divided. Those two questions have been the twin obsessions of economics ever since. While Marx was writing his critique, something was happening in universities that would reshape economics differently. It started with a simple puzzle. Why is a diamond worth so much more than water, even though water is far more essential to life? The diamond-water paradox. And in the early 1870s, three economists working independently, William Stanley Jevons, Karl Menger, and Leon Walras, arrived at the same answer, launching the marginalist revolution. The key insight: value isn't determined by total utility, but by marginal utility, the additional satisfaction from one more unit. If you have plenty of water, one more glass isn't worth much. A diamond, being rare, has high marginal utility when you have few. This shifted economics away from the labor theory of value toward a theory based on subjective preferences and scarcity. Price isn't about what something costs to make. It's about what someone will pay. This is where supply and demand really come into their own. The mechanism is genuinely elegant. Imagine the market for apples. Buyers have different maximum prices they'd pay. Line them up from highest to lowest, and you get the demand curve, sloping downward. Sellers have different minimum acceptable prices. Line them up lowest to highest, and you get the supply curve, sloping upward. Where they cross is the equilibrium price, where quantity demanded matches quantity supplied. The market gravitates toward this point. If the price is too high, surplus builds and sellers cut prices. If too low, shortage appears, and buyers bid it up. Nobody directs it. Prices act as signals carrying information. A rising price says this thing is scarcer, make more. A falling price says there's too much, do something else. Friedrich Hayek called this the marvel of the price system, arguing that no central planner could ever gather all the dispersed information that prices automatically aggregate. The whole economy is a vast network of interconnected markets, each generating price signals. Labor markets, where the price is wages. Capital markets, where the price is interest rates. Foreign exchange markets, where the price is the exchange rate. A self-organizing system of staggering complexity. And much of the time, it works astonishingly well. But it doesn't always work. Markets can fail, and understanding how and why is just as important as understanding how they succeed. The first failure is externalities, costs or benefits that fall on people outside the transaction. A factory produces widgets and pollution. The neighbors who get asthma didn't consent. The pollution cost isn't in the widget price, so too many get made. This is where government steps in, through pollution taxes, regulations, or cap-and-trade systems. The second is public goods, things non-excludable and non-rival, like national defense. You can't prevent free riders from benefiting. Private markets won't produce them adequately, so governments fund them through taxes. The third involves information asymmetries. George Akerlof's 1970 paper, The Market for Lemons, showed that when one party knows something, the other doesn't, like a used car seller concealing engine problems, markets can spiral downward. Only the worst products stay for sale, driving out good ones. This problem shows up in health insurance, financial markets, and countless other domains. And there's monopoly power. When a single company dominates, it can charge higher prices and produce less than competition would allow. This is why antitrust laws exist, though enforcement varies enormously. These market failures are why even ardent free market advocates agree government has a role. The debates aren't about whether government should be involved. They're about how much, in what ways, and where to draw the lines. Let's talk about something we haven't properly addressed yet: how economists actually measure the economy. Because before you can manage something, you need to measure it, and the way we measure economic performance has its own fascinating and somewhat controversial history. The most famous measurement is GDP, Gross Domestic Product. It's the total value of all goods and services produced within a country in a given period. When people say the economy grew by 3%, they mean GDP went up by 3%. It's the number that politicians brag about, that markets obsess over, that textbooks treat as the fundamental indicator of economic health. GDP was essentially invented during the Great Depression, largely by Simon Kuznets, a Russian-born American economist who would later win the Nobel Prize. The U.S. government needed a way to measure how badly the economy was doing, and Kuznets developed the National Accounts Framework that made GDP possible. He presented his first estimates to Congress in 1934, and for the first time, policymakers had a comprehensive picture of the nation's economic output. But here's the thing. Kuznets himself warned against using GDP as a measure of well-being. He explicitly said that the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income. And he was right to be cautious, because GDP has some serious blind spots. GDP counts everything that's bought and sold, regardless of whether it's good or bad. If there's a massive car accident, the ambulance rides, the hospital bills, the car repairs, they all add to GDP. If a factory pollutes a river, and then someone has to spend money cleaning it up, both the production and the cleanup add to GDP. Crime creates GDP through policing, prisons, and security systems. Divorce creates GDP. Lawyers, separate housing, duplicate household goods. GDP makes no distinction between spending that makes people's lives better and spending that's just repairing damage. Meanwhile, GDP ignores things that are enormously valuable but don't involve market transactions. If you raise your own children, that doesn't count. If you pay someone else to do it, it does. If you cook dinner at home, it's invisible to GDP. If you eat at a restaurant, it counts. Volunteer work, household labor, caring for elderly parents, none of it shows up. And the natural environment, clean air, clean water, biodiversity, a stable climate, has no place in GDP at all. You can cut down every forest in the country, sell the timber, and GDP goes up. The loss of the forest doesn't register. There have been various attempts to develop better measures. The Human Development Index, which combines income with education and life expectancy. The Genuine Progress Indicator, which adjusts for inequality, environmental costs, and unpaid work. Bhutan's famous Gross National Happiness. None of them has displaced GDP as the headline number, partly because GDP is relatively easy to calculate and compare across countries, and partly because, for all its flaws, it does capture something real about economic activity. But it's worth keeping in mind that when someone tells you the economy is doing well because GDP is growing, they're telling you something true but incomplete. The economy is more than its output. It's the quality of life it supports. Now, the great economic crises of the 20th century shaped economic thinking more profoundly than any theoretical argument. And the first, the big one, the one that reshaped economics more than anything since the Industrial Revolution, started in October 1929. The stock market had been booming for years. Ordinary people had poured their savings into stocks, often buying on margin, putting up as little as 10% and borrowing the rest. The market seemed like it could only go up. Shoeshine boys were giving stock tips. An apocryphal story, but telling. Supposedly Joseph Kennedy, the patriarch of the Kennedy political dynasty, decided to sell all his stocks after receiving investment advice from his shoeshine boy. If shoeshine boys are giving tips, he reasoned, the market has gone too far. Whether or not that story is true, the instinct was right. On October 24, 1929, Black Thursday, the market began to fall. Panic selling set in. Brokers called in margin loans, forcing investors to sell, which drove prices down further, triggering more margin calls and more selling. A vicious spiral. By mid-November, the market had lost roughly 40% of its value, but the crash was just the trigger. What followed was worse. Consumer confidence collapsed. People stopped spending. Businesses, seeing falling demand, cut production and laid off workers. Workers without income cut spending further. More businesses failed, more layoffs. Economists call this a deflationary spiral. Falling demand leads to falling prices to falling profits to layoffs, layoffs to less spending, and the cycle feeds on itself, pulling everything downward. And then the banks started failing. Between 1930 and 1933, roughly 9,000 American banks went under. 9,000. A bank run works like this. Depositors, fearing their bank is about to collapse, rush to withdraw their money. But banks don't keep all deposits in the vault. They lend most of them out. So when everyone withdraws at once, the bank can't pay. It fails. And because banks are interconnected, they lend to each other, hold each other's assets. One failure cascades into others. People's life savings simply vanished. Not stolen, not spent, just gone, because the institution that held them ceased to exist. By 1933, unemployment hit 25%. 1 in 4 workers had no job. Industrial production had fallen by nearly half. The depression was global, hitting Germany, Britain, France, Japan. In Germany, the desperation contributed directly to the rise of the Nazis. The Great Depression didn't just break economies, it broke democracies. And through all of this, the prevailing orthodoxy said, wait. Be patient, let wages fall. The economy will self-correct. Andrew Mellon, the Treasury Secretary, reportedly advised to liquidate everything. Labor, stocks, farmers, real estate, purge the rottenness. It was brutal advice, and following it made everything worse, because here's what the classical economists missed. In a normal downturn, falling wages and prices might help, because they make it cheaper to hire and buy, eventually stimulating recovery. But when confidence is shattered, when banks are failing, when the very mechanism of money creation is breaking down, falling prices don't help. They make it worse. Businesses postpone investment because they expect prices to fall further. Consumers delay purchases for the same reason. Debts become harder to repay because the dollars you owe are worth more than the dollars you borrowed. It's a trap, and once you're in it, the self-correcting mechanism doesn't work. This is the world John Maynard Keynes was looking at. Keynes was born in 1883 in Cambridge, England, and he was brilliant in the way that only a handful of people in any generation are brilliant. Educated at Eton and King's College, Cambridge, He was a member of the Bloomsbury Group alongside Virginia Woolf and E.M. Forster. He was a successful speculator. He managed King's College's endowment and multiplied its value enormously, though not without some harrowing near misses that would have bankrupted a less fortunate man. He married a Russian ballerina named Lydia Lopakova, to the astonishment of his Bloomsbury friends, who found her too vivacious and not sufficiently intellectual. He was, by all accounts, one of the most captivating conversationalists of his era. Here's a story about Keynes that captures something essential. During World War I, the British Treasury needed Spanish pesetas. The market was illiquid and the price high. Keynes's solution was to buy every available peseta, not just what was needed, but all of them. He cornered the market, then sold back the excess, having driven the price down. Audacious, borderline reckless, and it worked. That was Keynes. He didn't just theorize about markets. He played them, with real money and his own. In 1936, he published The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. The core message was revolutionary. The economy does not automatically self-correct. It can get stuck. It can settle into a low-level equilibrium where unemployment is high and stay there indefinitely. Here's the key insight. Classical economics assumed savings automatically become investment. If people save more, interest rates fall, making borrowing cheaper, encouraging investment. Keynes said this doesn't necessarily happen. In a recession, businesses don't invest just because borrowing is cheap. Nobody's buying their products. There's no point building a new factory when the existing one runs at half capacity. Savings pile up, uninvested, and the economy stays depressed. This is the paradox of thrift. If everyone tries to save more simultaneously, total spending drops. Businesses earn less. They lay off workers. Incomes fall, and people end up saving less, not more. What's rational for each individual is catastrophic for the group. Think of a crowded theater where everyone stands up to see better. Now, nobody can see at all. Keynes's solution: if private spending collapses, the government must step in and spend. Borrow if necessary. Spend on roads, bridges, schools, anything. The spending puts money in people's pockets. They spend it. Businesses see demand. They hire. The new workers spend their wages, creating more demand, and the economy climbs out. This is the multiplier effect. $1 of government spending generates more than $1 of activity, because each dollar circulates and recirculates. Keynes famously suggested that if the Treasury filled bottles with banknotes, buried them in coal mines, and left private enterprise to dig them up, unemployment would disappear. He wasn't entirely serious. He'd have preferred useful spending. But his point was that even wasteful spending beats no spending when the economy is in a depression. This was heresy to classical economists who believed in balanced budgets, but it worked. Government spending through the New Deal and eventually World War II pumped money into the economy on a massive scale. By 1945, the Depression was over. The success seemed to validate Keynes. Governments could manage the economy, stimulating during recessions, cooling during booms. This became the dominant framework from the 1940s through the early 1970s. Growth was strong. Unemployment was low. Incomes rose broadly. The gap between rich and poor narrowed. A golden age. But lurking inside the Keynesian framework was a problem Keynes had largely glossed over: inflation. And to understand inflation, we need to talk about how money actually works in a modern economy. Because most money isn't created by governments, it's created by banks. And that mechanism is one of the most fascinating and least understood in all of economics. Let me take a moment here to talk about something that Keynes understood better than almost anyone before or after him: the role of psychology in economics. Because the Great Depression wasn't just a mechanical failure of markets. It was, in a very real sense, a crisis of confidence. A crisis of what Keynes called animal spirits. Here's what Keynes meant by that term. Economic decisions, whether to invest in a new factory, whether to hire more workers, whether to launch a new product. These decisions aren't made by cold, rational calculation alone. They can't be, because the future is genuinely uncertain. Not just risky, uncertain. Risk is when you know the odds, like flipping a coin. Uncertainty is when you don't even know the odds, like trying to predict what the economy will look like in 10 years. And most important economic decisions involve uncertainty, not risk. So what drives those decisions? Partly analysis, sure, but also gut feeling, intuition, optimism or pessimism, the general mood of the business community. Keynes called these psychological factors animal spirits, and he argued they were a crucial driver of economic booms and busts. When business leaders feel confident about the future, they invest, they hire, they expand. Their spending creates income for others, who spend in turn, and the economy booms. When confidence collapses, as it did in 1929 and again in 2008, investment dries up, spending falls, and the economy spirals downward. And the shift from confidence to panic can happen suddenly, disproportionately, in a way that has nothing to do with the fundamentals of the economy. A rumor, a high-profile bankruptcy, a falling stock market, these can trigger a loss of confidence that becomes self-fulfilling. People expect bad times, so they cut spending, and bad times arrive. This is one of the deepest insights in all of economics. The economy is not just a machine that processes inputs and produces outputs. It's a system that runs partly on belief, on expectations, on stories people tell themselves about what's going to happen next. And those stories can change quickly, for reasons that are more psychological than economic. This is why recessions can sometimes seem to appear out of nowhere. The machinery of the economy was functioning fine, but the mood shifted, and the mood is part of the machinery. Think about what that means for policy. If the economy runs partly on confidence, then the government's words matter as much as its actions. A president who projects calm during a crisis can help stabilize expectations. A central banker who credibly promises to do whatever it takes, as Mario Draghi, the head of the European Central Bank, famously said during the European debt crisis in 2012, can sometimes stop a panic in its tracks, not by actually doing anything, but simply by convincing people that the worst won't happen. Expectations management is a real and essential tool of economic policy. It sounds like spin. It's actually closer to engineering. Keynes also understood something else that's worth mentioning, because it connects to how economics has been practiced and misused since his death. He was deeply skeptical of the idea that economics could be reduced to precise mathematical models. He once wrote that economics is a moral science, not a natural science, and that it deals in judgments, not certainties. He would have been horrified by some of what came after him, the increasingly mathematical, increasingly abstract models that dominated economics from the 1960s onward, models that assumed perfect rationality, perfect information, and frictionless markets, and that missed the 2008 crisis entirely, because those assumptions didn't allow for the kind of systemic, psychology-driven collapse that actually occurred. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. The point is that Keynes saw economics as fundamentally about human behavior under uncertainty, and that insight remains as relevant today as it was in 1936. Now, there's something else I want to mention about the post-war economic order, because it affects everything that comes later. After World War II, the Western nations didn't just adopt Keynesian economics. They built an entire institutional architecture to manage the global economy. The The Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The IMF was designed to provide short-term loans to countries experiencing balance of payments problems, countries that were running low on foreign currency because they were importing more than they were exporting. The World Bank was designed to fund long-term development projects in poor countries. And together with the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which later became the World Trade Organization, these institutions formed a framework for managing international economic relations that remains, in modified form, in place today. The idea behind all of this was simple and powerful. The catastrophes of the 1930s, the Depression, the trade wars, the competitive currency devaluations, the political extremism that followed, had been caused partly by a lack of international economic cooperation. Countries had pursued narrow self-interest, raising tariffs, devaluing currencies, and beggaring their neighbors, and everyone had ended up worse off. The post-war institutions were designed to prevent that from happening again by creating rules and mechanisms for cooperation, and largely they succeeded. The decades from 1945 to 1973 saw an unprecedented expansion of international trade, a dramatic reduction in tariffs, and broadly shared prosperity across the Western world. It wasn't perfect. It largely excluded the developing world, and it rested on American dominance in ways that created their own problems. But it was, by historical standards, remarkably successful. But before we get to the details of money creation, let me tell you about one of the most important and least understood chapters in economic history, the gold standard, and its spectacular rise and fall. Because for a long time, the answer to the question, what makes money valuable, was simple: gold. Money was backed by gold. You could, in theory, walk into a bank and exchange your paper bills for a fixed amount of the shiny yellow metal. And that system shaped the world economy for over a century. The gold standard worked like this. Each country defined the value of its currency in terms of a fixed weight of gold. The British pound, for instance, was defined as a certain number of ounces of gold. The American dollar was defined as another. And because both currencies were pegged to gold, the exchange rate between them was automatically fixed, determined by the ratio of gold in each. If gold flows out of a country because it's importing more than it's exporting, the money supply automatically contracts, prices fall, exports become cheaper and more competitive, and gold flows back in. It's a self-correcting mechanism, elegant in theory. And for a while, it worked. The classical gold standard, which operated from roughly the 1870s to 1914, coincided with a period of remarkable stability in international finance. Exchange rates were predictable, inflation was low, international trade grew. London was the financial center of the world, and the pound sterling, backed by gold and by the might of the British Empire, was the global reserve currency. But the gold standard had serious problems, and they became devastatingly apparent during the Great Depression. Remember, under the gold standard, the money supply is tied to the amount of gold a country holds. If gold flows out, the money supply contracts, and in a depression, when the economy needs more money, not less, this is exactly the wrong thing. Countries that stayed on the gold standard during the early 1930s were stuck in a deflationary trap. They couldn't expand their money supply to fight the downturn because they didn't have enough gold to back additional currency. The gold standard turned a financial crisis into a global catastrophe. The countries that recovered fastest from the Depression were the ones that abandoned the gold standard earliest. Britain left in 1931 and began recovering almost immediately. The United States partially left in 1933, when Roosevelt prohibited private gold ownership and devalued the dollar against gold. Sweden left in 1931, Japan in 1931. In each case, freeing the currency from gold allowed the government to expand the money supply and stimulate the economy. After World War II, the major Western nations created a new monetary system at a conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in 1944. Keynes himself was one of the architects, though his more ambitious proposals were overruled by the Americans. The Bretton Woods system was a modified gold standard. All currencies were pegged to the US dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. The United States, which had accumulated enormous gold reserves during and after the war, essentially became the anchor of the global monetary system. Bretton Woods lasted about 27 years. By the late 1960s, the system was under strain. The United States was spending heavily on the Vietnam War and on Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs, running persistent deficits and printing dollars faster than its gold reserves could support. Foreign governments, particularly France under Charles de Gaulle, began demanding gold for their dollars, draining American reserves. In 1971, President Richard Nixon made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable a decade earlier. He closed the gold window. The United States would no longer exchange dollars for gold at any price. The last link between money and precious metal was severed. Since 1971, the world has operated on what economists call fiat money, money that has value because the government says it does, not because it's backed by gold or silver or anything else. Fiat, from the Latin for "let it be done." The government declares it money, and money it becomes. This gives governments enormous flexibility. They can expand or contract the money supply as needed, without being constrained by the amount of gold in their vaults. But it also removes a constraint on government spending. There's nothing physical limiting how much money can be created. The only limits are self-imposed discipline and the consequences of getting it wrong, which, as we've discussed, can include devastating inflation. Every major currency in the world today is fiat money. The dollar, the euro, the pound, the yen, the yuan, none of them are backed by gold. They're backed by the economic output and the institutional credibility of the countries that issue them, and they work, mostly, most of the time. The global economy has functioned on fiat money for over 50 years now, and while there have been crises, the system has proven more flexible and resilient than the gold standard ever was. But it requires something that gold didn't. It requires that people trust the institutions that manage the money, and when that trust erodes, things get interesting in ways that nobody wants. Now, let's talk about how money creation actually works in a modern economy, because this is where it gets really fascinating. When most people picture money creation, they imagine a government printing press. And yes, central banks print physical currency. But cash represents only about 10% of the money supply. Where does the rest come from? Commercial banks, regular banks with branches on your high street. They create money through lending. Here's how. You deposit $1,000. The bank keeps a fraction, say 10%, $100, as a reserve and lends out $900. The borrower deposits that $900. Their bank keeps $90 and lends out $810. That gets deposited. And the next bank keeps $81 and lends out $729. By the time the chain plays out, your original $1,000 has generated roughly $10,000 in total deposits, $9,000 of new money, created through lending. This is fractional reserve banking. The money isn't counterfeit, it's real, sitting in real accounts, available to be spent. But it was created by the banking system, not by the government. And this means the money supply depends largely on how much banks lend. When banks are confident and lending freely, money expands. When banks get nervous and pull back, money contracts. Money literally disappears, not because anyone removed it, but because the lending that created it stopped. This is why banking crises are so devastating. The mechanism by which the economy creates its medium of exchange breaks down. Central banks, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, exist to manage this. Their primary tool is the interest rate. Lower rates make borrowing cheaper, encouraging lending and expanding money. Higher rates make borrowing expensive, slowing lending and tightening money. This is monetary policy. Now, inflation. It's a sustained increase in the general price level, meaning money's purchasing power falls. A little inflation, 2 or 3%, is considered healthy. It lubricates the economy, encourages spending over hoarding, and gives central banks room to cut rates during downturns. But high inflation is corrosive. It eats savings, makes planning impossible, and introduces uncertainty into every decision. And then there's hyperinflation. Weimar Germany, 1923. The government, burdened by war debts and unable to borrow, printed money. Prices doubled every few days. Workers were paid twice daily to rush out and spend before money lost value. There's the famous story of the woman who left a wheelbarrow of banknotes outside a shop and returned to find someone had stolen the wheelbarrow and left the money. The hyperinflation destroyed the middle class and contributed to the Nazis' rise. Zimbabwe experienced it in the late 2000s, with prices doubling roughly every 24 hours. Venezuela suffered severe hyperinflation, starting around 2016. In each case, the cause was the same: a government printing money to cover expenses it couldn't fund otherwise. Which brings us to Milton Friedman, the central figure in the next chapter. Born in Brooklyn in 1912, the son of Hungarian Jewish immigrants, Friedman became the intellectual leader of the Chicago School of Economics. He was a formidable debater, small in stature, but enormous in presence, with a knack for making complex ideas sound like common sense. He hosted a television series, Free to Choose, that reached millions. He was sharp, witty, and relentless. There's a story about Friedman at a conference in Asia, where a government official showed him a massive canal digging project. Thousands of workers were digging with shovels. Friedman asked why they weren't using modern earth-moving equipment. The official said it was a jobs program. The shovels created more jobs. Friedman replied, "Then why not use spoons?" The anecdote captures his essential argument, that efficiency matters, that make-work programs are wasteful, that the best way to help people is to let markets work. Friedman's great contribution was his reinterpretation of the Great Depression. Working with Anna Schwartz, whose role is often underappreciated, she assembled the massive data set that made their analysis possible and contributed enormously to the intellectual framework. He published A Monetary History of the United States in 1963. Their argument was explosive. The Depression wasn't caused by a failure of capitalism. It was caused by a failure of the Federal Reserve. The Fed allowed the money supply to contract by a third between 1929 and 1933. Banks failing, money disappearing, and the Fed just watching. If the Fed had acted aggressively, pumped money in, the Depression would have been an ordinary recession. This directly challenged Keynes. The problem wasn't insufficient government spending, it was bad monetary policy. The solution wasn't fiscal stimulus, it was getting money right. Just have the central bank expand money steadily, and the economy takes care of itself. By the late 1960s, something was giving Friedman powerful ammunition. The Keynesian consensus was cracking. The crack was called stagflation, a term that would have sounded oxymoronic to any earlier economist. Keynesian economics assumed a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, formalized in the Phillips curve. When unemployment is low, workers demand higher wages, pushing up prices. When unemployment is high, wage pressure eases. Policymakers could pick their spot on the curve. Low unemployment with some inflation, or low inflation with some unemployment. The 1970s demolished this. The 1973 oil crisis, OPEC quadrupling prices overnight, triggered something supposedly impossible. Inflation soared, and unemployment soared, simultaneously. Stagflation. The Keynesian toolkit had no answer. Stimulate to fight unemployment? That worsens inflation. Tighten to fight inflation? That worsens unemployment. Friedman had predicted this. In a landmark 1967 address, he argued the Phillips curve trade-off was only temporary. In the long run, there's no trade-off at all. If government keeps pushing unemployment below its natural rate, people come to expect inflation. Workers demand higher wages just to keep up with rising prices. Inflation expectations become self-fulfilling. You get high inflation and no reduction in unemployment. The 1970s proved him right. The political consequences were enormous. Paul Volcker, appointed Fed chairman in 1979, did what Friedman prescribed, raised interest rates to over 20% to crush inflation. It worked. Inflation dropped from nearly 15% to below 4% by 1983. But the cost was brutal. Unemployment hit 11%. Factories closed. Farms went bankrupt. And at the same time, Reagan in the United States and Thatcher in Britain were riding to power on free market ideology Friedman had popularized. Tax cuts, deregulation, privatization, weaker unions. The Keynesian consensus was out. The market revolution was in. Now let's talk about international trade. Because the modern economy is a deeply interconnected global system. David Ricardo, an English stockbroker turned economist, articulated the concept of comparative advantage in 1817, and it remains one of the most elegant ideas in economics. The setup. Imagine two countries. Even if one is better at producing everything, both benefit from trade if each specializes in what it's relatively best at. The opportunity cost is what matters, not absolute ability. Think of a lawyer who also happens to be the fastest typist in the office. Should they do their own typing? Their time is worth $200 an hour doing law and $40 doing typing. The secretary's time is worth $20 doing typing. Even though the lawyer types faster, the opportunity cost of their typing is too high. Hire the secretary. That's comparative advantage. Ricardo's insight has been the foundation for free trade for 2 centuries. And there's strong evidence that trade increases total wealth. But the gains aren't evenly distributed. Some workers benefit. Others lose their jobs when production moves overseas. A factory worker whose plant closes because manufacturing moved to China doesn't care about aggregate gains. His job is gone. His community is hollowed out. That tension between aggregate benefits and individual losses drives heated political debates to this day. And here's something important about trade that often gets overlooked. The gains from trade are real but diffuse, spread thinly across millions of consumers who pay slightly lower prices. The losses are concentrated, hitting specific communities, specific industries, specific people who can point to their closed factory and say, "This is what trade did to me." Diffuse gains versus concentrated losses is one of the most important dynamics in economics and politics, and it explains why trade agreements that are good for a country on average can be politically explosive. The winners don't notice their modest savings on consumer goods. The losers know exactly what they lost. Before we get to the 2008 crisis, let me take a moment to talk about something that often gets overlooked in economic discussions: why some countries are rich and others are poor. Because this is one of the biggest and most consequential questions in all of economics. And the answer, or rather the set of competing answers, tells you a lot about the field's deepest disagreements. Think about it. The United States has a GDP per capita of roughly $70,000. Norway is even higher. Switzerland is higher still. Meanwhile, the Democratic Republic of the Congo has a GDP per capita of about $600. That's a ratio of over 100 to 1. If you were born in Norway, you're statistically likely to live a long, comfortable, well-fed life, with access to excellent healthcare and education. If you were born in the Congo, you face poverty, disease, and instability. Same planet, same species, radically different outcomes. Why? The simplest answer, and the most obviously inadequate, is natural resources. Some countries have oil, gold, fertile soil, favorable climates. But this doesn't really hold up. Japan is resource-poor and wealthy. Nigeria is resource-rich and poor. Switzerland has no oil, no significant minerals, no great rivers for hydropower. It has mountains, cows, and banks, and it's one of the richest countries on Earth. Meanwhile, Venezuela sits on some of the largest oil reserves in the world and has struggled with poverty and economic crisis for years. Resources help, but they're clearly not the determining factor. There's even a concept called the resource curse, the paradox that countries with abundant natural resources often perform worse economically than those without. Because the resource wealth breeds corruption, crowds out other industries, and creates powerful elites who capture the wealth rather than distributing it. Another answer, popular among some development economists, focuses on geography. Jeffrey Sachs, among others, has argued that tropical countries face inherent disadvantages: higher disease burdens from malaria and other parasites, less productive agriculture, harder terrain for building infrastructure. There's something to this. Most of the world's poorest countries are in the tropics, and most of the richest are in temperate zones. But geography is not destiny, as the economic miracles of Singapore, Hong Kong, and South Korea demonstrate. These are places with few natural advantages that became wealthy through policy, institutions, and human capital. Which brings us to the explanation that most economists today find most convincing, though it's also the most controversial because of what it implies. Institutions. The argument, made most forcefully by Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson in their book Why Nations Fail, is that the key difference between rich and poor countries is the quality of their institutions, their legal systems, property rights, rule of law, democratic accountability, regulatory frameworks. Countries with inclusive institutions, those that protect individual rights, enforce contracts, limit corruption, and allow broad participation in economic life, tend to prosper. Countries with extractive institutions, those that concentrate power in a narrow elite that uses the state to enrich itself at everyone else's expense, tend to stagnate. This makes intuitive sense. Why would you start a business in a country where the government might seize your property? Why would you invest in education in a society where connections matter more than competence? Why would you innovate in a system where the profits will be taken by the ruling family's cousin? Institutions shape the incentives that individuals face, and incentives, as every economist knows, shape behavior. But here's where it gets complicated. If good institutions are the answer, how do you build them? You can't just export democracy to a country and expect it to work. Institutions emerge from specific historical circumstances. They reflect culture, power structures, colonial legacies, geographic realities. The institutions that made Britain prosperous in the 18th century grew out of centuries of political struggle: the Magna Carta, the Glorious Revolution, the gradual expansion of the franchise. You can't replicate that process by dropping a constitution out of an airplane, and this is where economics bumps up against its limits as a discipline. The question of why some countries are rich and others are poor isn't just an economic question. It's a historical question, a political question, a cultural question, a question about power and violence and accident and luck. Economics provides tools for thinking about it, but the answer lies in territory that no single discipline can fully map. I mention this because it connects to something important about economics itself. The field often presents itself as a science, precise, mathematical, objective, and in some ways it is. The models are rigorous, the data is increasingly abundant, the tools are powerful. But underneath the mathematics, economics is dealing with human beings, unpredictable, emotional, culturally embedded human beings, and that means its predictions are always provisional, always uncertain, always colored by the assumptions of the people making them. The most honest economists know this. The less honest ones pretend otherwise. There's another piece of this story that I want to tell you, because it's one of the most dramatic economic transformations in human history, and it happened so recently that we're still processing it. The rise of East Asia. In 1960, South Korea had a GDP per capita roughly comparable to Ghana's. It was a poor, agricultural country, devastated by war, with few natural resources, and a population of about 25 million. Today, South Korea is one of the wealthiest nations on Earth. It's home to Samsung, Hyundai, LG. It has universal health care, a world-class education system, and one of the fastest internet speeds anywhere. The transformation happened in a single generation. People who grew up in poverty, who remember their parents cooking over wood fires, now live in one of the most technologically advanced societies in the world. How? The answer is complicated, but several things stand out. First, massive investment in education. South Korea committed to universal literacy, and then to building one of the most rigorous education systems in the world. Human capital, the skills, knowledge, and health of the workforce, turns out to be one of the most important drivers of economic growth. More important than natural resources, more important than geography, arguably more important than anything else. A country's most valuable resource isn't under its soil, it's walking on top of it. Second, strategic industrial policy. The South Korean government didn't just step back and let the market sort things out. It actively directed investment into key industries: steel, shipbuilding, automobiles, electronics, providing subsidies, protecting domestic firms from foreign competition in their early stages, and then pushing them to compete globally. This is sometimes called the East Asian Developmental State Model, and it was followed, in various forms, by Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, and more recently by China. It challenges the free market orthodoxy that says government should stay out of the economy, and it's a powerful counterexample to the one-size-fits-all policy prescriptions that sometimes come from Western economists and international institutions. Third, integration into the global economy. South Korea didn't grow by turning inward. It grew by exporting, by producing goods that the rest of the world wanted to buy. This required quality, efficiency, and constant innovation. It required competing in international markets against the best in the world. And it required the kind of open trading system that the post-war international institutions had helped create. And then there's China. China's economic transformation since 1978 is, by any measure, the most dramatic in human history. In 1978, when Deng Xiaoping began economic reforms, China was one of the poorest countries in the world. Hundreds of millions of people lived in extreme poverty. Agriculture was collectivized, industry was state-owned and inefficient, and the economy had been devastated by the catastrophes of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Deng's reforms were gradual and pragmatic. He didn't impose a grand ideological blueprint. He famously said the approach was to cross the river by feeling the stones, moving step by step, testing what worked, keeping what succeeded, and discarding what didn't. First, agricultural reforms, allowing farmers to sell surplus produce at market prices, which dramatically increased food production. Then, special economic zones, designated areas where foreign investment was welcomed and market rules applied. Then, gradual opening of the broader economy to private enterprise and global trade. The results were staggering. China's economy grew at an average rate of about 10% per year for 3 decades. Hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty, the most rapid reduction in poverty in human history. China went from an economic backwater to the world's second-largest economy, its cities filled with skyscrapers, its factories filled with workers making the goods that fill the shelves of Walmart and Amazon. But the Chinese model also raises uncomfortable questions. Growth was achieved partly through political authoritarianism, suppression of labor rights, environmental degradation, and currency manipulation. Inequality in China has soared. The gap between coastal elites and rural poor is enormous. And China's integration into the global economy, while beneficial in aggregate, contributed to the loss of millions of manufacturing jobs in the United States and Europe. The China shock, as economists call it, wasn't just a gradual adjustment. It was a concentrated blow to specific communities that were ill-equipped to adapt. This is one of the great tensions of our time. Globalization has made the world enormously wealthier in aggregate, but the distribution of those gains has been radically uneven. The winners have been consumers in wealthy countries, who got cheaper goods, and workers in poor countries, who got jobs that paid better than subsistence farming. The losers have been workers in wealthy countries whose jobs were displaced, and who often found that the new economy had no place for them that paid as well as the old one. And this brings us back, as so many things do tonight, to the 2008 financial crisis, which was, in many ways, the moment when all of these tensions came to a head. Let's jump forward now, because there's a story that defined the early 21st century for millions of people, the 2008 financial crisis. And to understand it, we need to talk about how banks lend money for houses. Traditionally, mortgage lending was straightforward. A bank checked your income and credit, gave you a loan, held it for 30 years, and collected payments. Simple, boring, safe. But starting in the 1990s and accelerating through the 2000s, banks figured out they could sell the mortgages, bundle thousands together, and sell the bundle to investors as a mortgage-backed security. Investors collect interest payments. The bank gets its money back immediately and can lend again, bundle again, sell again. A machine for generating fees at every step. Here's where trouble started. Once the bank could sell the mortgage immediately, it didn't bear the risk. If the borrower defaulted, that was the investor's problem. So the bank had less incentive to check whether borrowers could actually repay, and investors relied on credit rating agencies, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, to assess risk. But the agencies were paid by the banks creating the securities, a massive conflict of interest. AAA ratings were stamped on securities backed by terrible loans. So banks made increasingly risky loans, subprime mortgages, to people who couldn't afford them. Adjustable rate mortgages with low introductory rates that would spike after 2 years, no documentation loans, ninja loans, no income, no job, no assets. The banks didn't care because they sold the risk. The investors didn't care because the ratings said safe. The agencies didn't care because the banks paid them. And many homebuyers didn't fully understand what they were signing. It was a system where nobody had the right incentives. And as long as house prices kept rising, nobody noticed the problem. People bought houses to flip them. Buy, wait for the price to rise, sell at a profit. The rising prices made everything seem safe. Even if a borrower defaulted, the bank could sell the house for more than the mortgage. The collateral covered the risk. As long as prices went up, think about what was really happening here, because it's a pattern that repeats throughout economic history. When something, houses, stocks, tulips, whatever, has been going up in price for a while, people start to believe it will keep going up forever. They develop what the economist Robert Shiller calls irrational exuberance. They buy not because the asset is fundamentally worth the price, but because they expect to sell it to someone else at a higher price later. This is sometimes called the greater fool theory. I know I'm overpaying, but I expect to find a greater fool who will pay even more. It works until it doesn't. Until you're the last fool, and there's nobody left to buy from you at a higher price. And then the music stops. In 2006, house prices peaked and began to fall. The entire edifice came apart. Borrowers found themselves underwater, owing more than their homes were worth. Default rates soared. Mortgage-backed securities turned out to be loaded with bad loans. Their value plummeted. Banks that had borrowed heavily to invest in them became insolvent. And because the system was globally interconnected, American banks had sold these securities to European banks, Asian banks, pension funds worldwide. The crisis spread like wildfire. In September 2008, Lehman Brothers, a 158-year-old investment bank, filed for bankruptcy, the largest in American history. The global financial system went into cardiac arrest. Credit markets froze. Banks stopped lending to each other. Even healthy businesses couldn't get short-term loans for payroll. The economy was on the brink. What happened next was fascinating from an intellectual standpoint, even though it was terrifying in real time. The response combined both Keynesian and Friedmanite approaches. Central banks slashed interest rates to near zero and launched quantitative easing, buying bonds to inject cash, exactly what Friedman had said the Fed should have done during the Great Depression. Governments spent massively on bailouts and stimulus, exactly what Keynes had prescribed. Congress passed TARP, authorizing $700 billion in bank bailouts. Britain effectively nationalized several banks. It was the biggest government intervention since World War II. The irony was profound. The crisis had been caused, in large part, by the very deregulation the free market revolution had championed. The institutions that had lobbied hardest for freedom to take risks were now being rescued by the taxpayers they'd argued should stay out of the way. Profits had been privatized during the boom. Losses were socialized through bailouts, and the recession was severe. Global GDP fell for the first time since the war. Unemployment hit 10%. Millions lost homes, and the recovery was deeply uneven. Which brings us to something important. The bailouts saved the financial system. That's almost certainly true. Without them, the collapse would have been far worse. But they also left a bitter taste. The banks that caused the crisis were rescued. Their executives, by and large, kept their jobs, their bonuses, their mansions. Meanwhile, ordinary people lost their homes, their savings, their retirement plans. Nobody on Wall Street went to jail. The system that had failed was patched up and put back in operation, largely intact. And the people who bore the costs of the crisis were not the people who had created it. This perception, accurate or not in every detail, but emotionally powerful, fueled populist anger on both the left and the right. It contributed to the rise of movements and political figures that challenged the economic establishment in ways that hadn't been seen in decades. The Tea Party on the right, Occupy Wall Street on the left, Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, Brexit. These are all, in different ways, responses to the feeling that the economic system is rigged, that it works for those at the top and fails everyone else. The crisis also brought the concept of systemic risk into sharp focus. Individual institutions might seem healthy, but the system as a whole could be fragile. It was like a forest where every tree looks fine, but the underbrush is so dry that one spark burns everything. The concept of too big to fail, that some institutions are so large and interconnected that their failure would bring down the entire system, became a permanent, uncomfortable feature of the landscape. And it created a terrible incentive problem. If a bank knows it's too big to fail, it knows the government will bail it out if things go wrong. So why be careful? This is what economists call moral hazard, when the very existence of a safety net encourages riskier behavior. Now, where does all of this leave us? Let's zoom out, because economics in the 21st century is in an interesting and somewhat humbling place. One of the most fascinating developments has been behavioral economics, which challenges the foundational assumption that people are rational. Classical economics assumes Homo economicus, a perfectly rational agent making optimal decisions. Real people are nothing like this. We are irrational in systematic, predictable ways. We're loss-averse. Losing $100 feels roughly twice as bad as gaining 100 feels good. This was demonstrated by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in the 1970s, and it has profound implications. It means people will take irrational risks to avoid losses, hold on to losing stocks too long, and reject perfectly good deals simply because they're framed as losses rather than gains. We anchor on irrelevant information. If someone mentions the number 50 before asking you to estimate Australia's population, your estimate will be higher than if they'd mentioned 10. We discount the future too heavily. We'd rather have $100 today than $120 next month. We follow the crowd. We overestimate small probabilities and underestimate large ones. We make different decisions depending on how the same choice is framed. People are more likely to choose a surgery described as having a 95% survival rate than one described as having a 5% death rate, even though they're identical. Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002, a psychologist winning the Economics Nobel, which tells you something. Richard Thaler developed the concept of nudging, designing choices to guide people toward better decisions without restricting freedom. His classic example is retirement savings. Most people know they should save more for retirement, but don't get around to it. If you make enrollment in a retirement plan the default, people are automatically enrolled unless they opt out. Participation rates jump from around 40% to over 90%. Same choice, same freedom. Dramatically different outcome, just by changing the default. Thaler won the Nobel in 2017. Behavioral economics hasn't replaced the standard model, but it's enriched it enormously and had practical policy consequences. Governments worldwide have created nudge units to design policies accounting for how people actually behave. And here's something about behavioral economics that I think is really beautiful, because it connects to the deepest human experiences. Think about how people evaluate their own well-being. Classical economics would say that what matters is your absolute level of income and consumption. If you have a comfortable house, enough food, access to health care, you should be happy, regardless of what your neighbors have. But that's not how people work at all. Research consistently shows that relative income matters as much as absolute income, maybe more. People judge their own well-being partly by comparing themselves to those around them. A famous study by economists Andrew Clark and Andrew Oswald found that people would rather earn $50,000 when everyone around them earns $25,000 than earn $100,000 when everyone around them earns $200,000. That's not rational in any economic sense. You're materially better off with $100,000, obviously. But psychologically, being richer than your peers feels better than being rich in absolute terms, but poorer than your peers. This has enormous implications for policy. It means that economic growth doesn't necessarily make everyone happier if the growth goes mostly to the top. If the economy doubles but all the gains go to billionaires, the average person doesn't feel wealthier, they feel poorer because the gap has widened. This is sometimes called the Easterlin paradox, named after economist Richard Easterlin, who observed that beyond a certain threshold of national income, further economic growth doesn't seem to increase reported happiness. Countries get richer, but their citizens don't get noticeably happier. Once basic needs are met, food, shelter, safety, healthcare, additional income buys less and less additional well-being. What matters more is relationships, community, purpose, autonomy, and yes, relative status. Now, this doesn't mean economic growth doesn't matter. For poor countries, growth is transformative. The difference between poverty and basic security, between malnutrition and adequate food, between preventable death and survival. But for already wealthy countries, the relationship between more growth and more happiness becomes much murkier. And this raises uncomfortable questions about the relentless pursuit of GDP growth that dominates economic policymaking in virtually every country. More on this in a moment. Let me tell you about one more concept that I think is crucial for understanding how the modern economy works, because it comes up in almost every major economic debate, and most people have never heard of it. It's called the tragedy of the commons, and it was popularized by the ecologist Garrett Hardin in 1968, though the underlying idea is much older. Imagine a village with a shared pasture, a common. Every villager can graze their cattle on it. Each individual villager has an incentive to add one more cow, because the benefit, more milk, more meat, goes entirely to them, while the cost of the additional grazing, the slight degradation of the pasture, is shared by everyone. So each person adds a cow, and another, and another. And because everyone is following their individual self-interest, the pasture is overgrazed, the grass dies, and everyone's cattle starve. Each person acting rationally in their own interest produces a catastrophic outcome for the group. Sound familiar? It should, because it's essentially the logic behind climate change. Overfishing, water depletion, deforestation, and most of the environmental crises facing the world today. The atmosphere is a common, the oceans are a common, the groundwater is a common, and everyone is adding their cow, rationally, because the individual benefit is immediate and tangible, while the collective cost is diffuse and long-term. The tragedy of the commons is essentially a negative externality writ large, and it illustrates something important about the limits of the invisible hand. Adam Smith's insight was that self-interest, channeled through markets, produces socially beneficial outcomes, and for many goods and services, that's absolutely true. But for commons, shared resources that nobody owns, self-interest produces destruction. The invisible hand, left to itself, will strip the pasture bare. You need something else. Regulation, property rights, collective agreements, cultural norms, to prevent it. This is one of the central challenges of 21st century economics. How do you manage the global commons, the atmosphere, the oceans, biodiversity, in a world of sovereign nations, competing interests, and short-term political incentives? It's a problem that economics alone can't solve, but economics has essential insights to contribute, about incentive design, about pricing externalities, about the conditions under which cooperation can emerge without top-down enforcement. The economist Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in 2009, the first woman to do so in economics, spent her career studying communities that successfully managed shared resources without either government control or private ownership. She found that people are more capable of self-governance than classical economic theory predicts, and she identified design principles that make collective management work: clear boundaries, rules matched to local conditions, monitoring, graduated sanctions, conflict resolution mechanisms. It was a hopeful finding, and a rebuke to both the libertarian view that only private property can prevent the tragedy of the commons, and the statist view that only government regulation can. Anyway, let's come back to the question of inequality, because it's the thread that runs through everything we've been talking about tonight. And then there's the question that might matter most today: inequality. The gap between rich and poor, within countries and between them, has become one of the defining issues of our time. In the United States, the share of total income going to the top 1% has roughly doubled since the late 1970s, from about 10% to about 20%. The median wage, the wage of the worker right in the middle, has barely grown in real terms for decades, even as productivity has risen substantially. This means the economy is producing more, but the gains are going overwhelmingly to those at the top. If you draw a graph of productivity growth and median wage growth from 1945 to the present, they track each other closely until about 1973, rising together in lockstep. Then they diverge. Productivity keeps climbing. Wages flatten. The gap between those two lines, between what the economy produces and what ordinary workers receive, is, in a sense, the defining economic story of the last 50 years. Thomas Piketty, a French economist, published Capital in the 21st Century in 2013, and it became an unlikely bestseller. 700 pages about wealth inequality, full of historical data and economic theory, that sold over 2 million copies worldwide. Piketty's central argument was elegant and unsettling. He expressed it in a simple formula: R greater than G. The rate of return on capital, the money you make from owning stocks, bonds, real estate, tends to exceed the rate of economic growth. When that happens, wealth naturally concentrates. The rich get richer, not because they work harder, but because their assets grow faster than the economy. Inheritance compounds. Dynasties form. Piketty argued that the mid-20th century, when inequality narrowed and the middle class flourished, was the exception, not the rule, driven by the destruction of 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and the deliberate policy choices that followed, particularly progressive taxation and the expansion of public services. The long-run tendency, absent intervention, is toward concentration. Whether you agree with his analysis and his proposed solutions, which include a global wealth tax, depends on your values. But that a dense academic treatise on inequality became a global phenomenon tells you something about the mood of the times. Now let me mention something that connects everything we've talked about tonight in a way none of the classical economists could have foreseen: the digital economy. Because the economy of the 21st century is different from anything that came before, in ways that matter enormously for how we think about value, labor, competition, and money itself. Think about the biggest companies in the world right now: Apple, Microsoft, Alphabet, Amazon, Meta. What do they actually make? Apple makes phones and computers, sure, but a huge portion of its revenue comes from services: the App Store, iCloud, Apple Music. Microsoft sells software and cloud computing. Alphabet is essentially an advertising company that happens to run the world's most popular search engine. Amazon started as a bookstore and became the infrastructure of online commerce. Meta sells advertising based on your personal data. These companies are extraordinarily valuable, collectively worth trillions, and they employ relatively few people compared to the industrial giants of the past. General Motors, at its peak, employed over 600,000 workers. Facebook, when it reached a market capitalization comparable to GM's peak value, employed about 25,000. The new economy creates enormous wealth with far fewer workers, and the wealth it creates flows primarily to those who own the technology, the platforms, and the data. And that raises questions about the nature of work itself. Automation has been transforming labor markets for centuries. The spinning jenny replaced hand spinners. The tractor replaced farm workers. The ATM replaced bank tellers. Each time, new jobs emerged to replace the ones that were lost, and living standards ultimately rose. Economists have a term for the fear that machines will make human workers obsolete: the Luddite fallacy, named after the early 19th century English textile workers who smashed weaving machines in protest. And historically, it has been a fallacy. Technology destroys specific jobs but creates more in the long run. But some economists worry that this time might be different. Artificial intelligence and machine learning aren't just replacing manual labor, they're beginning to replace cognitive labor. Legal research, medical diagnosis, financial analysis, translation, customer service, even creative work, tasks that were once thought to be uniquely human. If machines can do what minds can do, where do the displaced workers go? What new jobs emerge? Nobody knows for certain. And the honest answer is that previous waves of automation were disruptive in the short term, but beneficial in the long term. And the same may well be true this time. But the same may well be true is not the same as the same is guaranteed to be true. And the transition period, the years or decades when old jobs are disappearing faster than new ones appear, can be excruciating for the people caught in the middle. Let me talk about one more thing before we wind down, because it connects to everything we've discussed and would have been unimaginable to Smith or Marx or Keynes. The rise of digital money and cryptocurrency. In 2008, the same year the global financial system nearly collapsed, someone using the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto published a paper describing Bitcoin, a digital currency that operates without any central authority. No central bank, no government, no trusted intermediary. Instead, it uses blockchain technology, a distributed ledger maintained by thousands of computers, recording every transaction and making fraud virtually impossible through cryptographic proof. Think about what that means in context. We started tonight talking about money as a shared fiction, a collective agreement to treat certain things as valuable. Bitcoin is an extreme version of that idea. It says we don't need governments or banks to create and manage money. We can do it ourselves, with mathematics and code. The trust isn't in an institution, it's in an algorithm. Now, the question of whether Bitcoin and its thousands of imitators will transform the financial system or remain a speculative curiosity is genuinely open. Skeptics point out that Bitcoin is wildly volatile. Its price has swung from under $1 to tens of thousands of dollars and back, multiple times, making it unreliable as a medium of exchange or store of value. They note that it's environmentally costly. The energy consumed by Bitcoin mining rivals that of some countries, and they observe that it's rarely used for actual transactions. Most people who buy Bitcoin are speculating on its price, not using it to buy coffee. Enthusiasts counter that Bitcoin is digital gold, a hedge against government mismanagement of money, an asset that can't be inflated away by a central bank running the printing press. They point to countries like Venezuela and Zimbabwe, where government-issued currency became worthless, as evidence that decentralized money has value. And they argue that the underlying technology, the blockchain, has applications far beyond currency, in everything from supply chain management to voting systems to digital identity. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. But what fascinates me about cryptocurrency, whatever its merits, is how it circles back to the very beginning of our story. Money has always been about trust. For most of history, trust was embedded in physical objects, shells, coins, precious metals. Then in institutions, banks, central banks, governments. Now some people are trying to embed it in code. The medium changes. The underlying principle doesn't. Trust. All the way down. And central banks have noticed. Many are now developing their own digital currencies, central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. China is piloting the digital yuan. The European Central Bank is exploring a digital euro. The idea is to combine the efficiency of digital money with the stability and backing of a central bank. Whether these will complement or compete with cryptocurrencies remains to be seen. But the fact that central banks feel compelled to respond tells you that something has shifted in how people think about money. As you lie there tonight, letting all of this wash over you, here's something worth thinking about. Economics, for all its mathematical formalism and Nobel Prizes and pretensions to scientific rigor, is fundamentally a human discipline. It's about choices, about trade-offs, about what we value and how we organize ourselves to produce and share it. The models are useful. They help us see patterns, make predictions, understand mechanisms. But they're models, simplifications, maps of a territory so complex that no map can fully capture it. The history we've walked through tonight, from barter to Bitcoin, from Adam Smith's pin factory to the algorithms that now execute millions of trades per second, is a history of people trying to understand a system they created but don't fully control. A system that feeds billions every day, but also leaves hundreds of millions in poverty. A system that has lifted more people out of destitution in the last 200 years than in all of prior human history, but that also produces financial crises that destroy lives overnight. A system that runs on trust, on the shared fiction of money, the shared belief that the numbers on the screen mean something and that can shatter when that trust evaporates. The economists we've met tonight, Smith, Marx, Keynes, Friedman, Hayek, Piketty, Kahneman, they each saw part of the elephant. Smith saw the power of markets and the magic of specialization. Marx saw the exploitation and the concentration of power. Keynes saw the instability and the failure of self-correction. Friedman saw the importance of money and the dangers of government overreach. Hayek saw the limits of central planning and the wisdom embedded in prices. Piketty saw the relentless concentration of wealth. Kahneman saw the irrationality that makes us human, not machines. None of them saw the whole thing. Nobody has, yet. And maybe nobody can, because the economy isn't a machine you can take apart and reassemble. It's a living, evolving, endlessly adaptive system made up of billions of decisions every day, each one shaped by history, culture, psychology, accident, and hope. And that's okay. You don't need to understand everything about the economy to navigate it. You don't need a PhD to know that prices carry information, that debt has to be repaid, that there's no such thing as a free lunch, that incentives matter, that things that seem too good to be true usually are. Those are the core intuitions, the ones that survive every revolution in economic theory, the ones that Adam Smith would recognize and Keynes would nod at, and even Marx, grudgingly, would acknowledge. So let that settle. Let the numbers and the names and the theories dissolve into something softer, something gentler. The economy will still be there tomorrow, humming along in its impossibly complex way, adjusting prices, creating money through lending, transmitting information through billions of tiny signals that nobody fully understands. And you'll participate in it, as you do every day, without even thinking about it. Buying your coffee, checking your bank balance, tapping your phone, trusting that the numbers mean something. They do, because we all agree they do. And as long as we all agree, the whole magnificent, maddening, fragile system keeps going. one transaction at a time, one act of trust at a time, just like it always has. The invisible hand doesn't sleep, but you should. Let it do its work while you rest. Tomorrow, the market opens again. The prices adjust again. The coffee beans travel their impossible journey from a hillside in Colombia to your kitchen counter again. And none of it requires you to understand it, just to trust it, the way you trust the ground beneath your feet, the way you trust the sun to rise, not because you've checked the physics, but because it's always worked before. That's economics, really. At its deepest level, a species-wide act of faith, renewed every morning, in a system too complex for any one mind to hold. Sleep well. The numbers will still add up in the morning.